There are moments in life when one decision, one heartbeat of courage or mistake changes everything. For Claire Bennett, that moment came after a single night she never meant to happen. A night that blurred the line between loyalty and longing, between who she was and who she might become. She was the quiet strength behind a powerful man, Ethan Ward, a billionaire CEO admired by the world, but haunted by his own loneliness. What began as respect turned into something deeper, something dangerous, and when dawn came, Claire's only choice was to walk away. But fate doesn't let go so easily. This is not just a story about forbidden love or success lost in scandal. It's about two people who dared to face themselves, to question what integrity really means when the heart refuses to obey. Because sometimes, the greatest test of strength isn't what you build in the world. It's what you're willing to lose for the sake of truth. Stay with me, my beautiful friends, as we step into She Wanted to Quit after a night with her boss. But the billionaire CEO couldn't let her go. A story about love, redemption, and the courage to begin again. Welcome back, my beautiful family. Tonight, let me take you to a place where light meets shadow, where the sound of laughter hides the quiet ache of the human heart. Imagine a ballroom in downtown Chicago, high above the city where glass walls frame a skyline of endless silver and gold. Crystal chandeliers hang like frozen rain, and the air hums with the perfume of ambition. Every laugh, every toast, every handshake feels rehearsed, yet somewhere beneath it all, something real is waiting to breathe. Claire Bennett stands near the edge of the crowd, calm and composed. She has the kind of grace that doesn't need to be announced, quiet, self-assured, and utterly professional. Her navy gown falls in soft folds, modest yet elegant, the color of midnight water. She carries herself like someone who knows how to blend into luxury without ever belonging to it. Around her, conversations sparkle promotions, profits, power, but her thoughts are elsewhere, perhaps on her father back in Kansas, who taught her that dignity is measured not by titles, but by how you stand when no one is watching. And then, across the room, she sees him, Ethan Ward, the man who built empires before turning 40. The kind of name whispered in boardrooms with both envy and awe. To most, he is untouchable, the very image of success, tall, precise, wearing confidence like an expensive suit. But tonight, something is different. His smile doesn't quite reach his eyes. His posture, perfect as ever, carries the weight of exhaustion that money can't hide. When their eyes meet, it isn't dramatic. No music swells. It's quieter than that, like two notes of a melody that suddenly find harmony. For a moment, she forgets who he is, and he seems to forget what he's supposed to be. They share a polite smile, but behind it lies a flicker of something unspoken curiosity, recognition, perhaps a loneliness that mirrors her own. Later, during the speeches, fate places them side by side near the balcony doors. The city below sparkles through the glass, 1,000 stories unfolding under the same cold stars. Ethan leans slightly toward her, his voice low, smooth, but weary. "You ever wonder," he says, "if all this success ever comes at too high a cost?" Claire hesitates. No one ever asks questions like that at corporate galas. "I think," she replies softly, "the cost is forgetting why you started." He studies her, then really studies her as if her words have pulled him out of a fog, and she feels it too. A pulse in the air between them, fragile but undeniable. There's no flirtation in it, no intent, only a quiet understanding, a human moment between two people who have learned to wear their armor too well. Someone calls his name from across the room, and the spell breaks. Claire looks away first, pretending to admire the centerpiece of white orchids. She reminds herself of her own rule, the one that has guided her through years of corporate storms. Never mix emotion with work. It's a line she has never crossed, and never intended to. Yet tonight, the line feels blurred, like ink running in the rain. When Ethan turns to leave, he pauses for a heartbeat. "You have a way of making simple things sound profound," he says with a faint smile. She answers, Maybe simplicity is what we've all forgotten. And then he's gone, swallowed back into the sea of tailored suits and champagne laughter. But his absence feels louder than his presence. Claire stands by the glass wall, looking out over the glittering city. Somewhere down there, cabs crawl like golden beetles through the night. She imagines the millions of lives beneath those tiny lights, people chasing dreams, making mistakes, falling in love, or simply trying to make it through another day. And she wonders when her own life became so carefully arranged, so safely untouched. A soft voice inside her whispers, "Something is changing." She doesn't know what it is, or where it will lead, only that it feels both dangerous and alive. It's as if a door has opened inside her, one she didn't even know was there. Behind her, the orchestra starts a slow waltz. Couples glide across the marble floor, their laughter echoing under the chandeliers. Claire watches them, feeling both part of the scene and strangely apart from it. Her pulse is steady, her face serene, yet a spark lingers in her chest, a warmth she tries to dismiss as foolish. After all, Ethan Ward is her boss, a man who lives in a world she only visits. But that night, something unseen begins to take root. Not romance, not yet something subtler. A recognition, a sense that two souls, long adrift in their separate orbits, have briefly crossed paths under the same constellation. Later, as she leaves the gala and the night wind touches her face, Claire closes her eyes. The city hums below like a living thing. She feels the ache of something she can't name, a longing for meaning in a life built on schedules and structure, and far above, in one of the darkened windows of the hotel, Ethan Ward stands looking down at the same streets, feeling the same quiet, pull the kind that makes even the strongest wonder if perhaps they've been chasing the wrong kind of success all along. The night ends, but its echo remains, for both of them. It's the beginning of a story, neither intended to write a story not about power, but about the fragile human hunger to be seen, to be understood, and maybe, if the world is kind, to be loved without condition. And so, dear listener, the curtain falls on this first night not with a grand finale, but with a whisper of something real. In a world that celebrates noise, sometimes the most powerful moments arrive in silence. That night in Chicago lingered with Claire long after the music faded and the ballroom emptied, even as she returned to her quiet apartment, slipped off her heels, and stared at her reflection in the mirror. She felt at the afterglow of something she couldn't name. It wasn't attraction alone, nor simple curiosity. It was the unsettling awareness that, for the first time in years, someone had looked at her and seen her, and that realization frightened her more than it thrilled her. Claire Bennett had always lived by rules not the kind written in company handbooks, but the quiet, moral compass carved into her by her father. Growing up in a small town, 2,000 miles from the noise of Chicago, her world had been simple: an old farmhouse, Sunday dinners, and a father who taught her that honesty wasn't optional. It was a way of breathing. Her mother had left when Claire was 9, too young to understand the reasons, but old enough to feel the hollow it left behind. Her father never spoke ill of her. He just worked harder, aged faster, and tried to fill every empty space with kindness. He used to tell her, "Claire, when the world pushes you to choose between comfort and character, choose character. It's what keeps your soul clean." Those words became her foundation. Through college, through late nights, balancing jobs and classes, through her rise in the corporate world, Claire carried that voice like a lantern in her chest. It kept her steady, it kept her safe, and it taught her a truth she held sacred: never mix emotions with work. Work was order. It was where she could control outcomes, where effort equaled results. Feelings, she believed, only blurred the edges, invited mistakes, and left scars no resume could hide. That rule had protected her more times than she could count. It kept her from gossip, from reckless choices, from heartbreak. Until Ethan Ward. Ethan wasn't like the men she'd met in business, the ones who saw kindness as weakness or loyalty as a game. He was ambitious, yes, but his ambition had a strange gentleness to it. He remembered birthdays. He stayed late to mentor interns. He asked about people's families and actually listened. The company admired him, not because they feared him, but because they trusted him. And Claire, though she would never admit it aloud, respected him more than anyone she'd ever worked for. She told herself it was admiration, nothing more, that the flutter in her chest when he said her name was only respect in disguise. I respect him too much to ever blur that line. She'd once told her friend over coffee, and she had believed it. She needed to believe it. But lately, something had shifted. It wasn't in words or gestures. Ethan never crossed boundaries. It was in the silences, the moments between meetings when his gaze lingered a fraction too long, or when his tone softened just enough to make her heart stumble. And every time it happened, Claire reminded herself of who she was, the daughter of a man who believed integrity was everything. Still, even the strongest principles can tremble under the weight of being seen. There were evenings when Claire stayed late in the office, the city outside glowing like embers, and she'd catch her reflection in the window, a woman capable, respected, but also alone. She wondered what her father would say if he saw her now. Would he be proud of her success, or quietly worry about the loneliness she tried so hard to hide? Sometimes she imagined her mother too, the ghost of a woman who had once chased her own dreams and lost herself along the way. Maybe that's why Claire guarded her heart so fiercely. Love, in her eyes, was both beautiful and dangerous, a fire that could warm or destroy, depending on how close you stood. And so, she built her boundaries high, her routines precise. She wore professionalism like armor and hid her tenderness behind carefully chosen words. People admired her calm, her composure. Few realized that behind that, Grace lived a heart that still ached to be understood. Ethan saw glimpses of it, though neither of them spoke of it. He noticed the way she always carried a notebook with pages of quotes and small reminders. Be kind, stay honest, don't lose yourself. He once joked that she was the company's conscience. She'd smiled at that, not realizing how much it meant to be seen that way. But lately, when their eyes met across the room, something unspoken passed between them, a question, maybe, or a warning. Claire knew what it meant. She knew how easy it would be to step closer to cross that invisible line between respect and desire. Yet, the thought terrified her, because she also knew how quickly admiration could turn to ruin. She'd seen it happen to others women whispered about, careers quietly buried under judgment. And so, she told herself the same thing she'd told herself for years. I don't need love to feel complete. But as much as she tried to believe it, the echo of Ethan's words from the gala still lingered in her mind. You ever wonder if all this success comes at too high a cost? Late that night, long after she had put away her work and washed the city from her hands, Claire stood by her window again. The moon hung low over the skyline, soft and pale. She thought of the people still awake, janitors cleaning offices, cab drivers chasing fares, dreamers staring out at the same moon and asking themselves the same quiet question. Is this all there is, somewhere in that vast city? Ethan Ward was likely asking it too. Claire pressed her hand to the glass, feeling the faint chill beneath her fingertips. Her life had been built on certainty, on the comfort of clear lines and defined rules. But tonight, she could feel those lines bending, not breaking, just trembling under the possibility of something more. And though she would not admit it to anyone, not even herself, a small part of her wondered if perhaps the rules she lived by were never meant to cage her, only to guide her until she was brave enough to let them go. That thought stayed with her, quiet but insistent, like a light beneath the door, and somewhere deep down, where the mind cannot lie, Claire felt the first gentle pull of change. Not the reckless kind, but the kind that whispers softly, maybe, after all this time, your heart is ready to feel again. The following week, the memory of that gala still clung to Claire like the faint trace of perfume after a long evening. She tried to bury herself in work emails, reports, and deadlines, but sometimes, in the quiet between meetings, her mind wandered back to that ballroom. to Ethan's weary eyes, to the question he had asked her, half smiling and half broken. Do you ever wonder if success comes at too high a cost? That night had been meant to fade into another page of routine, yet something about it had stayed, echoing in the corners of her thoughts. And now, just 1 week later, fate or something gentler brought them together again. The company hosted another corporate event, this time a smaller gathering held in the same grand hotel. The speeches were predictable, the applause polite. Claire stood among the guests, nodding at words she'd heard 100 times before: numbers, growth, vision. But her heart wasn't in the room. Her attention kept drifting toward the tall glass doors that opened onto the terrace, where the city's lights shimmered like fallen stars. When the last toast ended, Claire slipped quietly outside. The night air was crisp, scented with lake wind and the faint tang of rain. The hum of conversation faded behind her, replaced by the steady rhythm of traffic below. She rested her hands on the cool marble railing and breathed, out here. The world felt real again, no pretense, no masks. Then she heard a voice behind her. I thought I was the only one escaping. Ethan stood a few feet away, his suit jacket unbuttoned, the top of his shirt slightly undone. The polished image of the CEO was still there, but softened human. For a moment, neither spoke. The city glittered between them like a shared secret. I needed air, she said quietly. The room felt too perfect. He nodded. Perfection can be exhausting. There was a tired honesty in his tone that caught her off guard. She turned to face him, and in the glow of the terrace lights, she saw something new in his expression. Not power, not charm, but a kind of quiet surrender. He leaned against the railing beside her, gazing at the skyline. You know, he said after a long silence, people always think the higher you climb, the more you see. But sometimes, the view just gets lonelier. Claire listened, unsure if he was talking to her or to himself. You've built something extraordinary, she said softly. Most people would give anything for what you have. He smiled, but there was no pride in it. That's the irony. You give everything to it, and one day you realize you've already given everything for it. The wind lifted a strand of her hair, and without thinking, Ethan reached out not to touch, but to gently tuck it behind her shoulder. His fingers hesitated midway, as if remembering the invisible line between them. Still, that near touch sent a shiver through her, not of fear, but of recognition. Two people standing too close to the truth. I used to know who I was. He continued. Before all the titles, the money, the expectations, somewhere along the way, I forgot what being human feels like. His voice cracked, just slightly. And in that fracture, Claire felt the full weight of his confession. She'd seen him command rooms, negotiate with senators, inspire thousands. But here, under the open sky, he looked like a man who had spent years building a fortress only to find himself trapped inside it. She turned toward him fully. You haven't forgotten, she said, her voice steady but gentle. You've just been surrounded by people who stopped reminding you. For a moment, he looked at her as if those words had reached a place long untouched. Maybe, he said quietly, maybe I needed someone to remind me. They stood in silence then, watching the city pulse below. The wind grew colder, but neither moved to go inside. Claire wanted to step back, to protect herself from what she felt rising in her chest, that dangerous mix of empathy and something deeper. Yet, there was a peace in simply standing there, in the shared quiet of two souls who didn't need to pretend. Ethan spoke again, barely above a whisper. Do you ever feel like you've built a life that looks perfect on paper, but doesn't fit your heart anymore? The question hit her like a mirror. She thought of her carefully arranged life, the rules, the control, the distance she kept from anything that could hurt her. Yes, she said after a pause. Every day. Their eyes met, and in that gaze, all pretense fell away. It wasn't about status or propriety anymore. It was about recognition. The kind that happens only when two people finally see the same ache reflected back at them. Then, for the briefest moment, his hand brushed hers. Neither of them had meant it. The touch was light as air, hesitant, but charged with something that words could never hold. Claire didn't pull away. She simply let the moment breathe, a fragile, impossible moment suspended between right and wrong, fear and longing. Ethan exhaled slowly. "I'm sorry," he murmured. "There's nothing to be sorry for," she answered, though both knew that wasn't true. They stepped apart, the spell gently breaking. Somewhere inside, laughter and music rose again, muffled through the glass doors. The world of roles and expectations was waiting the one where he was the CEO, and she was the assistant who would never cross the line. But for that small stretch of time on the terrace, they weren't those people. They were simply two hearts remembering what it meant to feel. Claire looked at the city one last time before turning back toward the door. "You should go in," she said. "They'll notice you're gone." He gave a faint, wistful smile. "They always notice when I'm gone. I just wish someone noticed when I'm there." She didn't know how to answer that, so she offered him the only truth she could. "Maybe you're just looking in the wrong direction." When she walked back inside, the warmth of the ballroom felt foreign. The laughter seemed too loud, the light too bright. She wasn't sure what had just happened, only that something inside her had quietly shifted again, like the tide changing direction. And as Ethan lingered alone on the terrace, staring after her, he realized that in one quiet conversation, Claire had done what no one else had managed to do. In years she had made him feel human again. The night moved on, but both of them carried its stillness within them, a reminder that even in a world built on noise and motion, sometimes all it takes is one honest moment to remind a soul of its own heartbeat. After that night on the terrace, something delicate and unspoken began to live between them, an invisible thread that neither of them dared to name. Claire tried to keep her focus, to stay behind her professional armor, but every meeting, every shared glance carried the quiet electricity of that moment under the city lights. It wasn't love, not yet. It was the awareness of something fragile, waiting at the edge of their restraint. The following Friday, another gala drew them both back into the same glittering world of glass and noise. Claire told herself it was just another event, another night of speeches and smiles. Yet, when she saw Ethan across the room, standing alone with that same quiet exhaustion in his eyes, she felt that familiar pull, the one that both comforted and terrified her. Later that evening, as guests began to leave and the orchestra played its final song, Ethan found her near the exit. "Let me drive you home," he said simply. She hesitated, searching his face for meaning, but his tone was calm, sincere, the kind of offer that wasn't about power or pretense, but companionship. The city was hushed that night. Streetlights stretched across the pavement like strands of gold, and the lake shimmered in the distance. Neither of them spoke for most of the drive. Words felt too heavy, too small. When the car stopped outside her apartment, Ethan turned toward her and said softly, "Can we talk? Just talk?" Something in his voice disarmed her. She nodded. And that was how they ended up at his penthouse overlooking Lake Michigan, a place she had seen only once in photographs, now softened by the glow of lamplight and the hum of the city below. The apartment was quiet, elegant, but not ostentatious. Books lined the walls, art hung with careful precision, and a faint scent of cedar lingered in the air. Ethan loosened his tie and poured 2 glasses of wine. Claire stood near the window, her reflection shimmering against the lake's silver surface. She wasn't sure if she was more afraid of being there or of wanting to be. When Ethan handed her the glass, their fingers brushed a small contact that carried the weight of everything unsaid. "You shouldn't have come," she said softly, her voice trembling between truth and apology. "I know," he admitted, "but I didn't want the night to end without being real for once." She turned toward him. "You're always real." He shook his head. "No. People see the CEO, the man who's supposed to have all the answers. They don't see the rest of me, the parts that are tired, lonely, afraid. Claire looked at him then, really looked at the man beneath the reputation, the one who carried responsibility like armor and guilt like a shadow. You're not just your title. Ethan, she said quietly, and you don't have to earn the right to be human. Her words seemed to reach him. He exhaled, as though letting go of something he had held for too long. And you, he said after a pause, you act like you owe the world perfection. You hide behind rules so no one can touch you. But you deserve to be seen. Too. Claire. His voice broke on her name, and for a heartbeat, the distance between them dissolved. I can't, she whispered. People already see me as the assistant. If they knew he stepped closer, if they knew, they'd see what I see. Someone who reminds me what truth feels like. Her breath caught. The air between them tightened, charged with all the things they hadn't allowed themselves to say. And then, without a plan, without a word, he reached out slowly, as though giving her time to walk away. But she didn't. When his hand touched her cheek, it was gentle, almost reverent. She could feel the hesitation in his fingertips, the question asking if this was wrong. Her own hand rose, almost against her will, resting lightly against his chest. His heartbeat was steady, but strong, a human sound, reminding her that beneath the roles and titles, they were just two people standing at the edge of something fragile and forbidden. The kiss came quietly, not out of impulse, but recognition. Two souls meeting where logic no longer mattered. It wasn't rushed or wild. It was careful, searching, full of pauses that spoke louder than words. It tasted of hesitation and longing, of years spent pretending not to need what every human heart eventually seeks: connection. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathing softly, as if afraid the moment would shatter. Claire tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. Her mind told her to leave, to walk away while she still could. Yet her heart whispered that, maybe, just this once, it was enough to feel. Ethan brushed a strand of hair from her face, his voice barely audible. We can stop here. But she shook her head, not in defiance, but in understanding. No, she said. I don't want to pretend I don't feel this. What followed wasn't the kind of passion that burns. It was the kind that unfolds slow, tender, trembling with honesty. Every touch spoke of vulnerability, of two people stepping out of the cages they had built around themselves. They didn't rush. They simply let themselves be. And in the quiet afterward, as the lake shimmered beyond the glass and the city hummed below, Claire lay beside him, not in triumph or regret, but in silence. She watched the faint rise and fall of his chest, the way his hand rested loosely near hers. It wasn't about desire. It was about being seen, being known, being accepted in all her flawed humanity. For years she had lived by rules to protect her integrity, and tonight she realized integrity wasn't about never crossing lines. It was about knowing when a moment is true and choosing it with a clear heart. When dawn began to bloom over the lake, she rose quietly, her heart full yet trembling. The world outside still looked the same, the streets, the sky, the restless hum of morning, but she knew something within her had shifted forever. She left before he woke, her footsteps soft against the marble floor. On the table by the window, she left a handwritten note, small, simple, honest, thank you, but this was wrong. Then she walked out into the pale morning light, her coat pulled close, her breath visible in the chill air. Guilt and gratitude mingled in her chest, but beneath them both was a strange, aching peace, the kind that comes when a heart finally admits what it has long denied. Behind her, in the penthouse high above the lake, Ethan stirred. He reached for her, found only empty space, and then saw the note. For a long time, he just stared at it, saying nothing. The city outside was waking, but inside, something quiet and human unfolded, the realization that, in losing her, he had found the truth he'd been running from. And though neither of them knew it yet, that night, the night that changed everything, would become the compass by which both would find their way back to themselves. The night had ended in silence, not the kind that follows an argument, but the kind that comes after truth has been spoken and there's nothing left to say. Outside Ethan's window, the city lay asleep under a silver dawn, the lake catching the first light like glass. Inside, two people rested in the fragile stillness that always follows a choice made from both courage and confusion. For a few hours, Claire slept beside him, her body still, her mind far away. But as the first blush of morning crept across the room, guilt began to rise in her like a tide. It was soft at first, a whisper of conscience, and then sharper, heavier, impossible to ignore. She opened her eyes to the unfamiliar room, the quiet luxury, the shape of Ethan's hand resting loosely near hers. The man beside her looked peaceful, vulnerable even, but that only deepened her ache, because she knew what this would mean once the world woke up. She knew the rules, both written and unspoken, that governed women like her. One night could erase years of respect, years of work, years of proving she belonged not because of who she was with, but because of who she was. Claire slipped out of bed, her feet cold against the marble floor. She moved carefully, as though even the air might betray her. Every step carried the weight of both tenderness and regret. She found her dress draped over a chair, her heels by the door, her purse on the table near the window, where the city stretched wide and gray. Her reflection caught her by surprise, her hair tousled, her eyes tired, her expression caught between two worlds, the woman who had dared to feel and the one who must now bear the cost of that feeling. On the table sat a notepad and a pen. For a long moment, she just stared at them. Words had always been her refuge, her way to make sense of the things she couldn't say aloud. Now they would have to carry the burden of goodbye. She picked up the pen and, in her neat, careful handwriting, wrote just one line. "Thank you." But this was wrong. She didn't add her name. She didn't need to. He would know. Folding the note once, she placed it beside the untouched glass of wine from the night before. Her fingers lingered on the paper, as though touching it could soften the truth it carried. But there was no softening it. Some choices, once made, cannot be rewritten. As she turned to leave, she looked back at him one last time. Ethan lay half in shadow, the early light tracing the lines of his face. He looked younger in sleep, almost like the man he might have been before success hardened him. And for a fleeting second, Claire wanted to stay to believe that the world could be kind enough to let them exist in this small, unguarded space. But reality, she knew, would not be kind. She took a deep breath, opened the door, and stepped into the quiet hallway. The carpet muffled her footsteps. The elevator ride down felt endless, each floor a small surrender. By the time she reached the street, the chill of morning hit her skin, sharp and cleansing. The lake shimmered under the dawn, and Claire walked toward it instinctively, as if drawn to its stillness. The air smelled of salt and iron and the faint sweetness of spring. She wrapped her coat tighter around herself and let the tears fall, not many, just enough to release the weight pressing on her chest. What have I done, she thought, not with shame alone, but with sorrow. She hadn't betrayed him. She hadn't betrayed herself. Yet something inside her ached as though she had lost a part of herself she didn't know she'd been protecting. In her heart, she repeated her father's words. When the world pushes you to choose between comfort and character, choose character. It had guided her all her life, and now, in the hollow light of morning, it would guide her again. She would resign. It was the only way to reclaim the integrity she had built her life upon. By the time the sun rose fully, Claire was already back in her apartment. She showered, dressed, and stood before her mirror, the same mirror that had watched her prepare for countless days at work. But today, she saw a woman changed, not broken, not ruined, simply changed. There was grief in her eyes, yes, but also a strange kind of peace. She had crossed a line, but she would not stay beyond it. At that same hour, high above the city, Ethan Ward woke to an empty bed. For a moment, he didn't move. He reached out, expecting to find her hand, but met only the cool sheet. The silence of the room pressed in on him, unfamiliar and sharp. Then he saw the note on the table folded once, small and final. He read it twice, then again, "Thank you." But this was wrong. The words were simple, but they struck him harder than any accusation could, because he knew she was right, and still, the loss of her, the absence of her voice, her steadiness, her quiet strength felt like a wound he hadn't been prepared to bear. He stood at the window, looking out over the lake where the first boats were beginning to move across the water. The morning light glinted against the waves, bright and merciless. He thought of all the things he could say to make her stay, to make this make sense, but every word felt hollow. So he said nothing. Instead, he folded the note once more and slipped it into the inside pocket of his jacket. It would stay there for a long time, a reminder of the one person who had dared to see him and the one he had let slip away. That day, Ethan canceled his meetings, ignored his calls, and sat in silence. Success had filled his life with everything measurable, but in that moment, he felt the depth of everything he couldn't measure: regret, longing, the quiet ache of what-ifs. And as the day faded into evening, both of them, in their separate corners of the city, felt the same truth settle over them. Sometimes the heart learns its hardest lessons not in chaos, but in the stillness that follows. For Claire, it was the beginning of reclaiming herself. For Ethan, it was the beginning of understanding that love, real love, cannot be built on guilt or secrecy. And though they did not know it yet, the distance between them that morning would become the very space where both would grow, where pain would eventually give way to grace, and where loss, quiet as it was, would one day make room for something wiser, something whole. The weekend after that morning passed in a blur, long hours of silence, half-finished thoughts, and the quiet ache of knowing that something once beautiful had turned into a weight neither could carry. Claire spent most of Saturday cleaning her apartment, as if scrubbing away the memory of that night could somehow cleanse her conscience. By Sunday evening, she had made her decision. The only way forward, the only way to honor what was true in her, was to walk away. Monday arrived cold and sharp. The sky hung low over Chicago, the streets still wet from early rain. Claire stood in front of her mirror, buttoning her navy suit jacket with hands that wouldn't stop trembling. The reflection staring back at her looked composed hair, smooth, lipstick precise, eyes steady, but inside, she was unraveling. In her briefcase lay the letter she had written at midnight, every word weighed with heartbreak and resolve. When she stepped into the glass tower that housed Ward and Company, the air felt different. People moved quickly, their voices clipped, their eyes darting between screens and hallways. The rhythm of the place, once familiar, now seemed foreign to her, almost hostile. Each step toward her office echoed with finality, but when she reached the top floor, she froze. Ethan was already there, standing by her desk, as if he'd known she was coming. His tie was loose, his expression drawn. The man who usually commanded a room with quiet authority now looked as though he'd been waiting for something he feared might break him. Their eyes met. For a long moment, neither spoke. "I thought you'd take the day off," he said finally, his voice low, tired. "I couldn't," she replied, clutching her bag. "There's something I need to give you." She reached into her briefcase, pulling out the white envelope. Her hand shook slightly as she placed it on the edge of his desk. He looked at it, then back at her. "What's this?" "My resignation," she said simply. The silence that followed was suffocating. Ethan stared at the envelope as though it were something alive, something capable of undoing him. "You don't mean that," he said finally. "I do." He took a step closer. "Claire, please don't do this. I have to." Her voice wavered, but her eyes did not. "What happened between us? It shouldn't have. It was a mistake." At that, something in him shifted a sharp flicker of pain, quickly masked by disbelief. "A mistake," he repeated. "Is that really what you think it was?" She looked down. "What else could it be? You're my boss. I'm your employee. We crossed a line that can't be uncrossed." Ethan's tone hardened, not with anger, but desperation. "Then I'll cross it all the way. If that's what it takes, I'll resign before I lose you." Her head snapped up. "Don't say that. I mean it," he said. "If walking away from this company means I can keep you, I'll do it." Tears welled in her eyes, unbidden. "You don't understand. This isn't about the company. It's about right and wrong, about who we are when no one's watching." He took another step closer. "And who are we?" "Claire. Because when I'm with you, I don't feel like the man everyone expects me to be. I feel—" He stopped himself, searching for words. "I feel human. For the first time in years." Her breath trembled. "And I feel everything I shouldn't. That's exactly why I have to leave." For a moment, the room felt smaller, as though the air itself refused to move. Outside, rain streaked the windows, soft and steady, like a quiet reminder of how fragile people can be. Ethan's voice broke the silence. "So that's it. You're just going to walk away?" "Yes." Her answer came quickly, though it hurt to say it, because staying would mean losing myself. He turned toward the window, his reflection fractured in the glass. "You think this doesn't cost me anything? You think I haven't been fighting this same war inside myself? I know you have," she whispered. "That's why this has to end before it destroys us both." He turned back to her, his expression raw, stripped of all composure. "You think I care about the rules, the board, the whispers? I don't. I care about you." Her voice softened. "And that's exactly what makes this so hard. Because I care too. But caring isn't enough to make it right." For a long time, neither spoke. The only sound was the hum of the city far below, and the faint ticking of the clock on the wall, time moving forward, indifferent to the hearts breaking beneath it. Finally, Ethan reached for the envelope, his hand hovering over it. "If I sign this," he said quietly, "if I let you go, will you at least tell me this meant something?" She looked at him, the man she respected, the man she had come to care for deeply, and in her silence, he found his answer. "It did," she whispered. "It meant more than I can say. But sometimes, meaning isn't enough." He closed his eyes, nodding once, as if accepting a verdict he'd already known was coming. Claire turned toward the door, her heartbeat steady, but her soul trembling. As she reached for the handle, Ethan's voice came again, low, almost broken. "Claire." She stopped but didn't turn. "Don't let this make you smaller," he said. "You're stronger than anyone I know. Don't let this take that from you." She swallowed hard, her throat tightening. "I won't," she said softly. And then, with quiet resolve, she walked away. The door clicked shut behind her, the sound final, yet echoing with everything left unsaid. Ethan stood alone in the office, the resignation letter still in his hand. Outside, the rain continued to fall, streaking the glass in thin silver lines. He read her words one last time, then set the envelope down carefully, as though it were something fragile. He knew he could stop her. One phone call, one command, and she would have to stay professionally, at least. But he didn't. Because love, he realized, was not about possession or power. It was about respect and letting go when holding on would only cause harm. Downstairs. Claire stepped out into the cold rain, her hair damp, her heart heavy. But beneath the ache was a quiet strength. She had done what she believed was right, even if it broke her. And though neither of them knew what came next, both carried the same fragile truth in their hearts. Sometimes love isn't meant to save us. Sometimes it's meant to teach us who we are when we finally learn to stand alone. The days following Claire's resignation unfolded with the quiet inevitability of a coming storm. There was no dramatic farewell, no public scene, just an email circulated by Human Resources announcing her decision to pursue new opportunities. But in an office where whispers traveled faster than memos, the truth, or rather, a distorted version of it, began to take shape. At first, it was nothing more than the occasional side glance, a pause in conversation when she entered the break room, a polite smile that didn't reach the eyes. Claire noticed, of course. She'd spent years reading people, knowing what was said in silence. By Wednesday, the air around her felt charged, not with admiration as it once had been, but with suspicion. Someone had seen her leaving the office late that night weeks ago. Someone else remembered the gala, the way Ethan had looked at her across the ballroom. By Friday, a rumor had begun to weave itself through the cubicles like smoke. It started small, a story told over coffee, a question disguised as concern. Then, as gossip always does, it gathered speed. Words like inappropriate and favoritism floated through corridors that had once felt safe. And though no one dared to confront her directly, Claire could feel judgment pressing down on her from every corner of the building. In meetings, her colleagues avoided her eyes. Conversations stopped when she entered a room. Even the receptionist, once friendly and warm, now greeted her with forced politeness. It was the quiet cruelty of the workplace, the kind that doesn't shout, but erases. She tried to carry on, keeping her head high, answering emails, and tidying her desk. But dignity can be a fragile shield when the world has already decided your story for you. By the following week, whispers had reached the upper floors. And that was when Marjorie Blake, the company's COO, a woman known for her poise and steel, asked Ethan for a private meeting. She closed the office door behind her, folded her arms, and looked him squarely in the eye. "Ethan," she said, "I've always respected you. You've built something remarkable here, but you're risking everything for one woman." He didn't answer at first, Marjorie continued, her tone calm but edged. "I know it's none of my business what happens outside these walls, but perception is power. The board is already murmuring. Clients are asking questions. This company doesn't run on feelings, it runs on trust. And right now, yours is slipping." Ethan stared at the city beyond the glass, his reflection caught between skyline and shadow. "You don't understand," he said quietly. "It's not what they think." Marjorie sighed. "It never is. But people don't trade in truth, they trade in stories. And right now, she's the story. Outside that room, the rumors turned darker. Someone leaked an anonymous photo, a grainy shot from the gala terrace, taken from a distance. Ethan and Claire, standing close under the city lights, their faces soft, turned toward each other, the intimacy unmistakable. By noon, the image had spread across social media. Billionaire CEO and his assistant late-night secrets at the gala. One headline read, others followed, each crueler than the last. The comments were merciless strangers dissecting her face, her career, her supposed intentions. Claire found out when her phone buzzed with messages from friends, some sympathetic, others just curious. When she saw the photo, her breath caught. It wasn't the image itself that broke her, but the captions beneath it, words written by people who didn't know her, yet spoke as if they owned her truth. By afternoon, she could no longer walk through the office without feeling eyes on her. The whispers had become open pity. "Poor thing," someone murmured as she passed. "It always ends the same." That night, she went home and sat by her window, the city lights blurring through unshed tears. For the first time, she didn't feel anger, only exhaustion. In her mind, her father's voice echoed faintly, "Choose character over comfort." But what happens, she wondered, when character itself becomes a weapon, when doing what's right still leads to ruin? She looked at her reflection, the same woman who had built her career on integrity, who had played by every rule, and now, one mistake, one human moment had undone it all. Her thoughts spiraled, quiet but relentless. A woman's mistake becomes a scandal. A man's mistake becomes a story. Ethan's name was everywhere too, but the tone was different. Reporters called him enigmatic, driven, a leader under scrutiny. His part in the narrative was one of intrigue, not disgrace. He was discussed, not condemned. She was dissected. It wasn't new. Claire knew this pattern too well, the way women carried the burden of perception, while men carried the privilege of redemption. She wasn't angry at Ethan. She was angry at a world that refused to let women be both human and forgiven. Still, she refused to let that bitterness consume her. Instead, she turned off her phone, made herself a cup of tea, and sat in the silence. Her career might be collapsing around her, but she still had her truth fragile, bruised, but intact. The next morning, Ethan tried to reach her calls unanswered, messages unread. He sent an email, long and raw, apologizing for not protecting her, for not seeing how deeply the world could turn against her. But Claire didn't reply. Not because she didn't care, but because she needed space to remember who she was outside of his orbit. In the following weeks, the gossip began to fade, replaced by newer scandals, fresher headlines. But the damage had been done. Reputations heal slower than wounds, and Claire's would take time. Still, amid the noise, she found something quiet, a sense of self that had survived the fire, the kind of strength that doesn't come from winning, but from refusing to let the world define your worth. And though the whispers lingered in the corners of her memory, she carried on not to prove them wrong, but to prove herself right. Because dignity, she learned, isn't given. It's reclaimed, one silent, steady breath at a time. After the storm of rumors, the office grew quiet, not peaceful, but heavy, as if the air itself carried the weight of what had been left unsaid. Weeks passed, yet the silence between Claire and Ethan remained like a closed door neither of them dared to touch. The company kept moving, projects resumed, deadlines returned, but the trust, that fragile, invisible bond, had been fractured. Claire worked from a corner of the office now, distanced both by her own choice and by others' whispers. Her resignation had not yet been finalized. Ethan had quietly held it back, citing transitional needs. It was his way of protecting her, or perhaps delaying the inevitable. Either way, the pause felt like borrowed time. Then came the emergency. A high-profile client, one of their largest investors, threatened to pull out of a major contract in Denver. Ethan called her into his office that morning, his tone all business. "We need to be there by this afternoon," he said. "You know the details better than anyone." Claire hesitated. "Ethan, maybe someone else." He cut her off gently. "No, it has to be you." She looked at him, searching for the subtext, but his expression was unreadable, professional, restrained. And so, against her better judgment, she agreed. The flight to Denver was on the company's private jet, though it felt more like a cage than a luxury. The cabin was quiet except for the steady hum of engines and the occasional clink of ice in a glass. Claire sat by the window, her gaze fixed on the clouds below. Ethan sat across from her, reading a report he wasn't really reading. Between them stretched an ocean of unspoken words. He tried once, softly, to bridge it. "You look tired." She smiled faintly, her eyes still on the window. "So do you." And that was all. The hours passed slowly, filled with the kind of silence that carried memory: the terrace, the night by the lake, the note she had left behind. Every now and then, their eyes met, only to drift apart again. There was no anger left between them, only a lingering ache for something they couldn't return to. When they landed in Denver, the sky was already dark with the threat of a storm. Meetings stretched late into the evening, voices rising, deadlines shifting. Yet, even amid the chaos, Ethan's attention kept flickering toward Claire, her calm professionalism, her quiet strength, the way she handled everything with grace despite the shadows still following her name. It was close to midnight when the call came. All flights out of Denver were grounded. A sudden snowstorm had swept across the Rockies, canceling every departure. They were stranded. Claire sighed, pulling her coat tighter around her. "I'll find a nearby hotel," she said. Ethan shook his head. "I already called ahead. There's a lakeside resort about 30 miles from here. They've got power, a generator, and a room left. 2 rooms, actually." She wanted to refuse. Every rational part of her screamed to put distance between them, but exhaustion had settled deep in her bones, and the thought of another night of sterile airport lights felt unbearable. "Fine," she said quietly. The drive was long and winding, snow falling thick against the windshield. When they finally reached the resort, a quiet wooden lodge surrounded by pine trees, the world outside had turned white. Inside, the air was warm, smelling faintly of cedar and firewood. The staff greeted them kindly, unaware of the headlines that had followed them just weeks ago. 2 rooms, side by side. After checking in, they met for dinner in the small restaurant downstairs. Only a few tables were occupied. The fire crackled softly in the stone hearth. For a while, they ate in silence, the sound of snow against the windows like a steady, private rhythm. Then Ethan spoke. "It's strange," he said, his voice low, "how fast everything can fall apart. One moment, you think you've built something unshakable, and then one mistake, one rumor, and suddenly you're the villain in your own story." Claire looked at him for the first time that night. "You're not the villain, Ethan." He gave a small, bitter smile. The world would disagree. She hesitated, then asked quietly, "Does it still bother you?" What people think he thought for a moment before answering. "It used to. I spent years trying to protect an image, but lately, I wonder if that image ever really mattered. Success, power, reputation, they don't fill the empty parts." His words hung between them, honest and raw. Claire set down her fork, her voice barely above a whisper. "I used to think integrity meant never making mistakes, but maybe it just means owning them and learning who you are after." He looked at her then, and something in his expression softened. "You've always known who you are, Claire, even when everything around you tried to tell you otherwise." The quiet stretched again, but this time it wasn't heavy. It felt like breathing after holding your breath for too long. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in a kind of fragile peace. The storm that had trapped them also, somehow, had freed them at least from pretense. Later, when dinner ended, they walked out to the edge of the frozen lake. The night air was sharp but calm. The moon hung low, its light turning the snow into silver. For a moment, they stood side by side, not as CEO and assistant, not as scandal and headline, but simply as 2 weary people who had weathered too much. Claire spoke first. "Do you ever wonder if maybe all of this, everything that happened, was meant to slow us down, to make us see what really matters?" Ethan nodded slowly. "Maybe that's the only way life teaches us, by breaking what we thought was unbreakable." She smiled faintly, her breath misting in the air. "Then maybe we're both still learning." He looked at her, really looked, and for the first time in weeks, the heaviness in his eyes eased. "Maybe we are." When they finally returned inside, the fire had burned low, the last embers glowing faintly like small hearts refusing to go out. That night, in their separate rooms, both lay awake, not in longing, but in quiet reflection. The storm outside had stilled, and so had something inside them. And though nothing had been fixed, something important had shifted. Forgiveness had not yet arrived, but understanding had, and sometimes, that is where healing truly begins. The storm passed quietly overnight, leaving the world wrapped in a rare stillness. By morning, the sky above the mountains had cleared to a pale winter blue, and sunlight sparkled across the frozen lake like scattered glass. Claire awoke to that silence soft, forgiving the kind that invites reflection more than rest. She dressed slowly, her thoughts still tangled with the conversation from the night before. Ethan's words had lingered. Maybe life teaches us by breaking what we thought was unbreakable. It wasn't a line from a man trying to win her back. It was the truth of someone finally seeing the cracks in himself. They had breakfast in the small lodge cafe, speaking little, but without the old tension. There was a quiet civility between them, now a fragile understanding that felt safer than anything they'd had before. When it was time to check the weather, the clerk at the front desk smiled apologetically. "Flights are still grounded," she said. The storm delayed everything another night. Ethan turned to Claire, the faintest smile tugging at his lips. "Looks like we're stuck again." She exhaled, half amused, half uncertain. Maybe the universe has something more to say. That evening, after the sun slipped behind the mountains, they met again by the lake. The air was crisp, the ground blanketed in snow that glittered under the moonlight. The water, though mostly frozen, shimmered where thin lines of ice met open space, silver merging with shadow. They walked slowly along the wooden path that circled the shore, their breath visible in the cold, The world felt smaller, gentler, the kind of quiet that makes honesty possible. Claire broke the silence first. "When I was little," she said, "my mother used to tell me that love does one of two things. It either makes you brave, or it breaks you." Ethan glanced at her, his expression soft. "Which one do you think it did to you?" She thought for a moment, her voice steady but low. "Both. It broke me in ways I didn't expect. But maybe that's how it made me brave." He stopped walking, turning to face her. The moonlight caught the edge of his face, tired. "Yes, but honest. Claire," he said quietly, "I don't expect forgiveness. I just don't want what we had or what we could have to be defined by our mistakes." She looked up at him, eyes glistening with unspoken emotion. "You think love can survive something like that?" "I think real love doesn't survive in spite of the pain," he said. "It survives through it." There was a stillness between them, then not awkward, but sacred. The kind that exists when two people finally stop pretending. Claire's heart trembled. She had spent months trying to rebuild her sense of self, trying to convince herself that letting him go was strength. And it was but strength, she realized, wasn't the same as peace. "I don't know if I can go back," she whispered, "to what we were, to who I was." "I don't want to go back," Ethan replied softly. "I just want us to start again, not as boss and assistant, not as two people who made a mistake, but as two people who learned from it." The words hung in the air, carried gently by the wind off the lake. She studied him, the man who had once seemed untouchable, now standing before her, stripped of all power, all pretense. Just a man, flawed and hopeful, asking for a chance not at redemption, but at truth. "I don't trust easily," she said. "I know," he answered. "That's why it means something when you do." He reached out then, not to claim, but to offer. His hand hovered between them, open, patient, and for a long moment, Claire just looked at it. The choice before her wasn't simple. It never had been. Love, she knew, wasn't about erasing the past. It was about choosing again and again to believe that something broken could still become beautiful. She placed her hand in his, slowly, deliberately. The touch was warm, despite the cold. Not the fevered spark of their first encounter, but something quieter, steadier. It was a touch that said, "I see you. I'm not ready to forget, but I'm ready to try." Ethan's thumb brushed over her knuckles, tentative but certain. Neither spoke. The moonlight washed over them, softening every edge. For the first time, the silence between them didn't hurt. It healed. They walked on like that, hand in hand, their footprints side by side in the snow. Each step felt like a small promise, uncertain, imperfect, but real. At one point, Claire looked up at the stars scattered across the sky, their light trembling over the frozen lake. "Maybe," she said softly, "my mother was right. Maybe love does make you brave." Ethan smiled, his voice barely more than a breath. "Then maybe we're both braver than we thought." They stopped at the far end of the path, where the lake met a cluster of pine trees. The wind whispered through the branches, carrying the faint scent of winter wood. Claire leaned against the railing, her hand still in his, her heart lighter than it had been in months. She didn't know what would come next, whether the world would ever forgive, or whether it even needed to. But for now, here, in this stillness, forgiveness had begun where it mattered most, between two people learning how to see each other again. When they finally turned back toward the lodge, the snow had stopped falling, and the moon's reflection stretched unbroken across the ice. It was beautiful in its simplicity, a mirror of something once fractured, now whole again, if only for the night. And as they walked, fingers intertwined, the future felt fragile but possible, the kind of hope that doesn't shout, but hums quietly in the background of the heart. Because sometimes, after everything has been lost and rebuilt, love doesn't arrive with fireworks or grand declarations. Sometimes it returns as a whisper, steady, honest, and enough. The morning after their quiet walk by the lake dawned clear and silver, as if the storm of the past days had finally washed the world clean. The snow outside the lodge sparkled in the sun, untouched and pure. For the first time in months, Claire woke with a kind of peace, fragile, but real. She and Ethan had spoken honestly, and though no promises were made, something between them had settled. Not closure, but understanding. They shared breakfast together before leaving, two travelers bound by something deeper than circumstance. The flight back to Chicago was calm, quiet. Through the window, the landscape stretched in long ribbons of white and gold, and Claire allowed herself to breathe. For the first time, the future didn't feel like something to fear. But peace, as she would soon learn, rarely lasts long in a world that feeds on chaos. By the next morning, everything had changed. It began with a message from a colleague, just a single text that arrived as she poured her first cup of coffee. "Have you seen the news?" Her hands froze around the mug. Within minutes, her phone began buzzing uncontrollably. Emails, calls, messages from people she hadn't heard from in years. She opened the browser, and there it was. Her face, next to Ethan's, splashed across half a dozen tabloids. Billionaire CEO and his assistant. The secret affair that shook Ward and Company. The photo was unmistakable, taken during their walk around the lake, captured from a distance through the trees. Ethan's hand in hers, the moonlight glinting on the snow. It was the kind of image that told a story all its own, and none of it true. Her heart pounded. Every word in the article felt like a blade twisting, sensationalized, cruel. There were speculations about promotions, favoritism, even manipulations. They turned tenderness into scandal, empathy into betrayal. By the time she reached the office that morning, the building was surrounded. Cameras flashed from the sidewalks. Reporters shouted questions she couldn't bear to hear. "Claire, is it true? Were you involved while you worked for him? Did you get special treatment? Are you still together?" Each word struck like hail. She pushed through the doors, head low, eyes burning. Inside, the whispers had already begun, again louder now, fueled by something tangible. Ethan arrived an hour later. He looked composed, but his jaw was tight, his eyes shadowed. His security detail surrounded him as he entered, but even that couldn't shield him from the onslaught of flashes and questions. When their eyes met across the lobby, it was like two survivors recognizing each other after a wreck. No words, just quiet devastation. By noon, the story had spread beyond the company. National outlets picked it up, twisting facts into fiction. The internet, as it always does, feasted. Photos from old events were dragged up, taken out of context. Anonymous sources emerged. A simple act of humanity. Two people walking hand in hand had become ammunition. Ethan called an emergency meeting with the board. Behind closed doors, voices rose and fell. Some demanded his resignation. Others urged silence. Through it all, he sat still. The same composure that had once made him untouchable, now betraying him, because the world doesn't forgive power when it stumbles. Marjorie Blake, the COO, looked at him with something like pity. "Ethan," she said quietly, "this isn't about truth anymore. It's about optics. And right now, we're bleeding trust." He said nothing. There was nothing left to defend. Meanwhile, across the city, Claire sat alone in her apartment, blinds drawn, laptop closed. The phone hadn't stopped ringing, but she no longer had the strength to answer. The sound of her name on television made her stomach twist. She had spent a lifetime building a reputation on professionalism, restraint, and quiet dignity. And now, in less than 24 hours, it had been reduced to gossip. That evening, she turned on the TV out of habit, not curiosity. She wasn't ready for what she saw. Her father's face appeared on the local news broadcast, a grainy clip of him standing outside his small hardware store back in Kansas. Reporters crowding him, microphones thrust toward his tired face. "Do you have any comment on your daughter's relationship with Ethan Ward?" one of them asked. Her father looked straight into the camera. His voice was calm, steady, and full of grace. "My daughter's the kind of person who tells the truth, even when it costs her. Whatever's being said, it's not who she is." Then he turned, walked back into his store, and shut the door behind him. Claire pressed her hand over her mouth, tears slipping down her cheeks. That small act of faith, quiet, unwavering, broke something open inside her. Shame. Yes. But also gratitude. She realized, in that moment, how fragile everything truly was. Reputation, she thought, could be destroyed overnight, but character, if tended carefully, could endure even under fire. As the headlines raged and social media tore her name apart, she sat in the stillness of her small apartment, breathing slowly, deliberately. She couldn't control what people said. She couldn't rewrite the story the world wanted to tell, but she could live the truth that had always guided her, the one her father had taught her long ago. When the world strips everything away, what remains is who you are when no one's watching. The night stretched long and sleepless. Outside, snow began to fall again, soft, relentless, erasing the marks of the day. Somewhere across the city, Ethan was likely watching the same storm from his office window, wondering how everything they had touched had turned to chaos. And yet, beneath the noise and the ruin, something steady still lived between them. Not romance, not longing, but the faint pulse of understanding, the knowledge that both had tried, in their own imperfect ways, to be true. As she turned off the lights and sat in the dark, Claire whispered into the silence, not as prayer or regret, but as truth. Let them say what they will. The storm will pass. It always does. And though she didn't know it yet, that belief, quiet and defiant, would become her anchor in the days ahead, when the world would test not her image, but her strength. The headlines didn't fade overnight. They multiplied. Within days, the scandal had turned from rumor to spectacle discussed on morning shows, dissected in podcasts, whispered across business conferences. Every photograph of Claire and Ethan, every word they had ever spoken in public, was replayed and reinterpreted inside Ward and Company. The tension was unbearable. The building that had once thrummed with quiet pride now pulsed with unease. The board demanded answers. Investors demanded stability. And the man at the center of it, all Ethan Ward, seemed to stand at the eye of a storm he could no longer control. Claire knew what was coming. She could feel it in every look, every meeting request, every silence that lasted too long. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about her. She had become the face of his fall, whether she wanted it or not. For 3 nights, she barely slept. She replayed every decision that had brought her here, every word, every moment, every heartbeat that had crossed a line. By the 4th morning, she had made her choice. If she couldn't undo the damage, she could at least take responsibility for it. That day, an emergency board meeting was called. The conference room at Ward and Company was vast glass walls, polished oak table, the skyline of Chicago stretching beyond the windows. 12 board members sat around it, faces drawn tight with concern and judgment. At the head of the table sat Ethan, silent, composed, his eyes shadowed. When Claire entered, the room shifted. Conversations stopped. Every head turned toward her. She stood tall, her navy suit pressed, her hands steady even as her heart raced. "Ms. Bennett," one of the board members began, his tone clipped. "We weren't expecting you." "I know," she said calmly, "but I need to say something." She stepped forward, holding a folded piece of paper, her resignation letter. "I understand the damage this has caused," she said, her voice quiet but unwavering. "To the company, to its reputation, to the people who believed in us. I never wanted that. My choices, both personal and professional, have created distraction and division. So, I'm here to take full responsibility." She placed the letter on the table, her gaze moving to Ethan's. "Effective immediately. I'm resigning from my position." The room was silent for a moment, the kind of silence that hums before a thunderclap. Then Ethan stood, "No." The single word broke through the stillness, sharp and final. He moved to stand beside her, his presence commanding. "You're not resigning," he said, his voice low but steady. You have done nothing wrong. If anyone should be held accountable, it's me. Claire turned toward him, eyes wide. Ethan, don't! But he continued, looking directly at the board. You want someone to blame me. I'm the one who crossed the line, who let emotions interfere with judgment. I'm the one who failed to protect someone who worked for me, someone who gave everything to this company. The COO, Marjorie Blake, leaned forward. Ethan, this isn't about guilt. It's about leadership. We can't afford this kind of scandal. He met her gaze. Then you can't afford me. A murmur rippled through the room. Claire felt her breath catch. Ethan, please, she whispered, her hand brushing his sleeve. Don't ruin everything you've built. This company needs you. He turned to her, and for a moment, the noise of the room fell away. It doesn't need me if I can't stand by what's right. His eyes softened. And what's right is not letting you take the fall for both of us. He faced the board again. You want a headline? Here's one you can use. He paused, his tone resolute. Effective today. I'm stepping down as CEO. The room erupted. Voices rose in disbelief. You can't be serious, Ethan. Think this through. The market will collapse. But Ethan didn't flinch. He placed his watch and company badge on the table, the sound echoing through the room like punctuation. This company will survive, he said. It's built on people stronger than me, people like her. Claire stood frozen, tears welling despite her effort to remain composed. She wanted to stop him, to tell him that this wasn't the solution, but one look at his face told her that his mind was already made up. Marjorie's voice softened. Ethan, you don't have to do this. I do, he replied, because for once, I want to make a decision not out of power, but out of love. The word hung in the air, love raw and unvarnished. It didn't belong in a boardroom, and yet, in that moment, it carried more truth than any financial report ever could. The silence that followed was thick with disbelief. Claire took a step closer to him, her voice trembling. Ethan, please don't do this for me. He turned to her, a faint, bittersweet smile on his lips. I'm not doing it for you. Claire, I'm doing it because of you, because you reminded me that success without integrity isn't success at all. Her throat tightened, her heart breaking under the weight of his words. You don't have to prove anything. He shook his head gently. Maybe not to them, but to myself I do. Then he looked around the room, meeting each board member's gaze one last time. You can replace a CEO, he said quietly. But if you forget why this company was built to lead with honesty, then all of this, he gestured around him, means nothing. With that, he turned toward the door. For a long moment, no one moved. The board members sat in stunned silence, unsure whether they had just witnessed an act of recklessness or something profoundly human. As Ethan reached for the handle, Claire found her voice. Ethan, he paused. She stepped forward, her tone soft but certain. Thank you for standing up, for not letting me disappear under their judgment. He looked back at her eyes, tired but full of quiet peace. You were never meant to disappear. And then he was gone. The door closed behind him with a soft click that seemed to echo for miles. Claire stood there for a long moment, staring at the empty space he had left. The room was still heavy with tension, but somewhere beneath the shock, something else lingered: respect. Even Marjorie, the hardest voice in the room, looked down at the table, her expression unreadable but not unkind. When Claire finally walked out of that boardroom, she didn't feel victorious or defeated. She felt free, though freedom, she realized, often comes wrapped in loss. Outside, the city was still noisy, still unforgiving, but as she stepped into the cold air, she felt a small warmth inside, the kind that comes when someone has stood beside you, not to shield you, but to remind you that you deserve to stand tall. And for the first time in a long while, she believed it. When the news broke that Ethan Ward had resigned, it swept through the city like wind through dry leaves, fast, restless, impossible to contain. Within hours, it was everywhere: business networks, morning talk shows, social media headlines flashing his name beside words like scandal, sacrifice, love. But behind those words, the truth was far quieter. Inside Ward and Company, the atmosphere was strange, part disbelief, part mourning. The empire Ethan had built stood intact, yet something essential had been stripped away. His office remained untouched, the glass walls reflecting an emptiness that no one dared disturb. And Claire? She knew it was time. The morning after the board meeting, she arrived early, before most of the staff. The building was still and half lit, the smell of coffee and paper lingering faintly in the air. She walked through the corridors one last time, each step carrying memories of laughter, late nights, and quiet victories that no one had ever seen. Her desk, once neatly ordered, was now half-packed. A small framed photo of her father sat by her hand, his steady eyes reminding her who she was before all this began. She placed it carefully into a box, along with a few pens, a notebook, and a single white mug that read, "Keep going." It wasn't the things she took that mattered, but the space she left behind. By mid-morning, the rest of the office had filled. Conversations stopped when she passed. Some colleagues offered polite smiles, others couldn't meet her gaze. There was pity in a few eyes, judgment in others, but somewhere in the quiet nods from those who truly knew her, there was respect. People whispered as she packed the last of her things. Words like brave, reckless, tragic floated in the air, though no one said them aloud. Claire kept her posture straight, her chin lifted. Dignity, she thought, is not silence, it's grace under the weight of being misunderstood. Around noon, she took one last look around her desk. For years, this place had been her measure of success. Every project, every late night, every moment of pride was tied to these walls. But as she stood there now, she realized that no title, no office, no paycheck had ever defined her worth. Before leaving, she slipped a small note under Ethan's office door. It wasn't a letter, just a few words written in her clean, deliberate hand. "Thank you for standing up when it mattered." Then she turned, her box in her arms, and walked toward the elevator. The ride down felt like an eternity. Through the glass panels, she could see the city sprawling below, busy, indifferent, alive. As the elevator doors opened to the lobby, a few employees looked up. Some nodded quietly. One young intern whispered, "Good luck, Ms. Bennett." Claire smiled faintly. "You too." Outside, the noise of the street hit her all at once. Cameras, voices, flashes. A crowd had gathered, reporters shouting questions she'd long stopped answering. "Did you know he was going to resign? Do you blame him? Are you still in contact?" She said nothing. She just kept walking. The air was cold, her steps steady. Later that afternoon, Ethan appeared before the press for the first and only time since his resignation. Dressed in a simple charcoal suit, he stood behind a single microphone. No entourage, no prepared statement. The cameras clicked furiously, waiting for the headline moment. But when he spoke, his words were not defensive or dramatic, just measured, human. "I have spent my life building something I believed would last," he began, "and maybe it still will. But somewhere along the way, I confused image with integrity. And I've learned the hard way, integrity isn't about image. It's about truth, even when that truth costs you everything." He paused, letting the words settle. "There are people who've been hurt by what's happened, people I care deeply about. I hope, in time, my actions will speak louder than the noise surrounding us now." Then, with a small nod, he stepped away. He didn't take questions. He didn't look back. By the end of the week, both Ethan and Claire had vanished from public view. The news cycle moved on, as it always does, chasing newer stories, fresher scandals. What remained were echoes quiet, human ones. Some said they had seen her once, months later, sitting alone in a small cafe by the river, notebook open, pen in hand. Others claimed Ethan had left the city entirely, perhaps to start something new, away from the glare of corporate glass. The truth, as always, belonged to neither rumor nor record, only to the quiet spaces in between. For Claire, the days that followed were not easy. There were mornings when she woke and wondered if it had all been for nothing, the work, the sacrifice, the love. But each time doubt crept in, she would remember the way Ethan had looked at her in that boardroom, not with regret, but with reverence. And that memory reminded her that even the most painful endings can hold a kind of grace. In time, she found a new rhythm, slower, smaller, freer. She began to write again, not for approval, but for understanding. Sometimes her words were messy, unfinished, but they were honest, and that, she decided, was enough. Ethan, too, learned to live with the quiet. Away from headlines and board meetings, he rediscovered the man beneath the title, the one who could breathe without the constant need to perform. And though their paths had diverged, something bound them, still not the scandal, not the past, but the simple truth that both had chosen to live by conscience, not convenience. As winter turned to spring, the city forgot their story, as all cities do. But somewhere, in the quiet hum of morning light on a still lake, their choices lingered reminders that sometimes doing the right thing means letting go, even when every part of your heart wants to stay. Because love, Claire realized, isn't always about holding on. Sometimes, it's about releasing with grace and trusting that what was true will remain, even when the world has moved on. And in that quiet knowing, she found peace. Time, as it always does, began to soften the sharp edges of everything. After the storm of headlines faded, after the city found new stories to obsess over, Claire slipped quietly out of Chicago and into a different rhythm of life. There was no announcement, no farewell, just one last look at the skyline she had once loved and a deep breath that felt like both an ending and a beginning. 6 months later, she was living in Oregon, a small coastal town where the mornings smelled of pine and salt water, and the world moved at a gentler pace. She worked at a nonprofit that helped single mothers find housing and job support work that didn't pay much, but paid in peace. The office was a converted farmhouse, its wooden floors creaking softly underfoot. There were no elevators, no glass walls, no high-stakes meetings, just people, ordinary and earnest, trying to do good in a world that often forgot how. In this new quiet, Claire began to heal, not all at once, but slowly, like a tide reclaiming the shore after a storm. Some days she felt light again, free even. Other days, she caught herself looking out over the misty ocean and thinking of him, wondering where he was, whether he had found peace too. Ethan had vanished from the public eye after his resignation. There were rumors that he had moved to Europe, that he was consulting for startups, that he'd disappeared into solitude somewhere in the mountains. Claire didn't chase the truth. For once, she had learned that not every unanswered question needs to be solved. Instead, she built a life that was small, but her own. She learned to grow herbs on her windowsill, to bake bread on Sunday mornings, to take long walks by the cliffs when the sky turned gold in the evenings. The quiet suited her, though sometimes it echoed too loudly. On one such morning, a letter arrived. It was simple, handwritten, addressed in a familiar slant that made her heart stutter. There was no return address, only her name, Claire Bennett, written with care. She hesitated for a long time before opening it. Her hands trembled as the paper unfolded, the ink faintly smudged at the edges, as though it had traveled far. Claire, I don't know if this will reach you, or if it even should, but I wanted to say thank you, not for forgiving me, but for teaching me what it means to be honest with myself. These past months have been quiet in a way I never knew quiet could be. I've spent them thinking about everything I lost, and everything I finally learned to let go of. You once told me that integrity is doing the right thing when no one is watching. I used to think I understood that, but I did not until you walked away. You didn't choose me, and I can't blame you for that. Maybe love, real love, isn't about being chosen. Maybe it's about wanting the best for someone even when it doesn't include you. I hope you're happy, truly. If peace has found you, then maybe that's enough for both of us. Ethan Claire read the letter twice, then a third time. The words blurred by the end, not because they hurt, but because they were so gentle. There was no demand in them, no plea for return, only gratitude, and something deeper than apology. She folded it carefully and sat by the window, watching the ocean roll against the cliffs. The letter had stirred something she thought she had buried, not the longing to go back, but the ache of remembering how deeply she had once cared. For a long while, she said nothing, just breathed. The sound of the waves filled the room, a rhythm that matched the steady beat of her heart. Forgive or move on, she thought. The question lingered like a whisper, but maybe those two things weren't opposites. Maybe forgiveness was a kind of moving on, the kind that didn't erase the past, but accepted it as part of the story. Her life now was quieter, humbler, but it was real. She didn't need grand gestures or headlines. She needed moments like this morning, sunlight filtering through the window, the soft hum of the kettle, the letter of a man who had once broken her heart and, in some strange way, helped her find it again. That night, she walked to the shore. The sky was awash of soft indigo, the horizon fading into mist. She sat on a smooth rock and looked out at the waves, her hands tucked into her coat pockets. The wind carried the scent of the sea sharp, alive, forgiving. She thought of her father, of his quiet strength, and of her mother's long-ago words, "Love makes you brave, or it breaks you." Maybe, she realized, it had done both, but from the pieces, she had rebuilt something stronger herself. The letter stayed on her desk for weeks afterward. Sometimes she read it again, not to rekindle what had been lost, but to remind herself that some endings aren't failures, they're transformations. And though she never wrote back, she carried his words with her on the days when doubt crept in, when she questioned whether leaving had been right. They reminded her that even broken stories could hold beauty, that closure doesn't always come through reunion, but through acceptance. Months passed. The air grew warmer, the coastline greener. On a bright afternoon in May, Claire helped plant a small garden behind the nonprofit's office. She pressed her hands into the soil, feeling its coolness, its promise. Around her, laughter echoed simple, human, healing. And as she stood under the Oregon sun, the wind lifting her hair, she felt something she hadn't in a long time, peace without ache. She smiled to herself, quietly. Maybe love didn't have to last forever to matter. Maybe its purpose was simply to awaken something true, something that stays, even when the people don't, far away, in some distant corner of the world. Ethan Ward might have been looking at the same sky, thinking the same thought. But Claire didn't need to know. Some connections, she realized, don't need to be rekindled, only remembered with kindness. And in that gentle space between memory and hope, she let the past rest not as a wound, but as a chapter that had taught her how to live, how to forgive, and how to begin again. By the time autumn returned, life had begun to bloom gently around Claire again. The Oregon coast had taught her the language of quiet, the way mornings could start without urgency. How healing arrived not as a sudden revelation, but as a steady, tender unfolding. She was no longer the woman who measured herself by her productivity or the weight of others' approval. She was simply herself, and for the first time in years, that felt like enough. Still, there were moments, quiet ones, when her mind wandered back to the man who had once changed the course of her life, not with longing, but with gratitude. He had been both her storm and her mirror, showing her the places she needed to rebuild, and though their paths had separated, she often wondered whether fate would let them cross again. 6 months later, it did. The nonprofit she worked for was invited to a leadership and ethics conference at Lake Tahoe, a gathering for professionals devoted to rebuilding trust in the corporate world. Claire hesitated when she saw the event flyer, her heart skipping as she read the list of keynote speakers. Among them was a name she hadn't spoken aloud in months, Ethan Ward. For days, she debated whether to go. Part of her wanted to decline, to keep the past sealed in peace. But another part, the one that had learned courage through pain, whispered that perhaps closure wasn't always the act of walking away. Sometimes, it was showing up. So, she went. Lake Tahoe that November was breathtaking glassy water, framed by mountains dressed in amber and gold. The conference was held at a lakeside lodge surrounded by pines, where the air smelled of cedar and the evenings hummed with the sound of wind through the branches. On the first day, Claire sat near the back of the grand hall as speakers took turns on stage. When Ethan's name was announced, she felt her pulse quicken despite herself. He walked out to the podium, and for a moment, time folded in on itself. But he was different now. The sharp confidence that had once defined him was softened, replaced by something steadier, humbler. His hair was a little grayer at the temples, his suit simpler, his presence quieter. Yet there was a calm strength in him, the kind that comes only from loss endured and lessons learned. His speech wasn't about success, it was about truth, about how leadership without empathy becomes tyranny, and ambition without integrity becomes emptiness. He spoke not as a man defending his past, but as someone who had finally made peace with it. When he finished, the audience rose in a standing ovation. Claire stayed seated, her hands folded in her lap, her heart full. It wasn't pride she felt, nor sadness, just the quiet recognition of growth. Later that evening, during the conference dinner, their paths finally crossed. She had stepped out to the terrace to catch her breath, drawn by the glow of the moon reflected in the still lake. And then, behind her, a familiar voice, softer now, but unmistakable. Claire. She turned. For a long moment, neither spoke. The air between them seemed to hold the echo of everything they'd been through, the pain, the distance, the forgiveness that had existed even in silence. "You look well," he said, a gentle smile in his eyes. "So do you," she replied. "Different, but, well," he chuckled quietly. "Different is accurate." He gestured toward the water. "It's beautiful here, isn't it?" "It is," she said. "Peaceful." They stood side by side for a while, watching the moonlight ripple over the lake. The silence wasn't uncomfortable anymore. It was the kind of silence that spoke of understanding of things that no longer needed to be said. Finally, Ethan broke it. "I read about the work you're doing," he said. "The non-profit, housing, community outreach. It's incredible. Claire, you've always been the kind of person who builds things that matter." She smiled, the words warming her. "It's not much, but it feels honest. That's more than I could have said a few years ago," he admitted. She looked at him, then really looked. The man before her was no longer the CEO who had commanded rooms or chased headlines. He was simply Ethan, grounded, human, at peace with his own imperfection, and for the first time, she saw him not as the man who had broken her world apart, but as the one who had helped her find herself again. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked quietly. "The company, the power." He thought for a moment, then shook his head. "Sometimes, but not for the reasons you'd think. I miss the purpose, not the pressure. I used to believe success was about being seen. Now I think it's about what you can build quietly, what no one applauds you for." Claire nodded, her eyes soft. "That sounds like wisdom, more like humility," he said with a wry smile. "And maybe that's a better teacher." There was a pause, the kind filled not with distance but possibility. Then, slowly, he turned toward her. "Claire," he said, his tone careful but earnest, "I don't expect anything from you. I just wanted to say that seeing you here, it feels like life is giving me one last chance to say what I should have said long ago." She waited, her breath shallow. He continued, "I was never the man you deserved, but I've spent these past years trying to become someone who could stand beside you, not above you. So, if there's ever a way back, not to what we were, but to something new, I'd like to find it. Together. As equals." The words hung in the cold night air, tender and uncertain. Claire looked at him, her eyes reflecting the lake's quiet shimmer. She didn't rush to answer. She didn't need to. What mattered wasn't the promise, but the honesty. After a long moment, she said softly. You don't have to prove anything. Ethan, not to me. We've both become who we were meant to be. Maybe that's the point. He nodded, accepting her words not as rejection, but as truth. And still something in his gaze carried hope, quiet and patient. They walked along the edge of the lake together, their footsteps light against the wooden path. Conversation flowed easily, not about the past, but about life, work, the small joys they had both discovered in simpler things. When they reached the far end of the dock, he offered his hand. She hesitated only for a heartbeat, then placed hers in his. It wasn't the trembling, uncertain touch of years ago. It was steady, familiar. Above them, the stars burned quietly over Lake Tahoe. The wind stirred the water into soft ripples. Carrying their reflection into the dark, two figures standing side by side, no longer defined by scandal or sorrow, but by the simple grace of having found their way back to understanding. And though neither spoke it aloud, both knew that life had given them something rare, not a second chance at the same story, but the courage to begin a new one. Sometimes, that is all love asks for. Not forever, just the chance to begin again. Wiser, kinder, and free. After that night at Lake Tahoe, life didn't rush to tie its loose ends neatly. Instead, it unfolded the way healing often does, quietly, in small, deliberate steps. Claire returned to Oregon, and Ethan went back to the city. But this time, there was no ache in the distance between them. What had once been absence now felt like space, the kind that allows two souls to breathe and grow before finding their way back together. They began writing again, not love letters, but thoughtful exchanges about purpose, about work, about what mattered beyond ambition. Ethan would send her articles about startups that aimed to use technology ethically. Claire would reply with reflections on community, empathy, and how innovation could still serve humanity without losing its soul. Over time, those letters became calls, and those calls became plans. It was Ethan's idea first, though. He presented it not as a grand gesture, but a quiet proposal. What if we started something together, he said over the phone one evening, his voice steady, almost shy. Something that gives back instead of takes. Claire hesitated for only a moment. What kind of something? He paused, as if afraid she might say no. A consulting firm. Small, focused on helping ethical tech startups, companies, trying to make technology more human, not less. She smiled to herself, imagining him pacing as he spoke, the same spark of idealism that had once made him brilliant, now tempered by humility. You don't need me for that, she teased gently. His reply was simple. I do, because I don't want to build another empire. I want to build something meaningful, and I can't think of anyone who understands that better than you. And so, Ward and Bennett Consulting was born, though Claire insisted her name come first, just this once. They started small, working from a rented cabin by a lake not far from Tahoe, surrounded by tall pines and the steady hush of water. Their days were filled with purpose, their nights with quiet laughter, and the kind of companionship that feels less like falling in love and more like finding home. The partnership was one of equals. Ethan no longer led with power, and Claire no longer followed from the shadows. They discussed every decision, every client, every project with a mutual respect, built from the lessons they had paid dearly to learn. Sometimes, in the evenings, after long hours spent poring over proposals, they would sit on the porch overlooking the lake. The sunsets there were breathtaking gold dissolving into amber, then fading into the deep blue of twilight. Those were the moments when words were unnecessary. On one such evening, late in spring, the air was soft and cool, and the surface of the lake shimmered under the fading light. They had finished their work for the day, and Claire was barefoot on the porch, a glass of tea in her hand, her hair caught up loosely as the wind moved through it. Ethan stepped outside, carrying something small in his pocket. For a long while, he just stood beside her, their shoulders touching as they watched the horizon darken. Then he spoke, his voice low and thoughtful. You know, he said, I used to think love was about passion, about the fire, the intensity, the kind that consumes everything around it? She smiled faintly, and now he looked at her, his gaze soft. Now, I think it's about peace, the kind that lets you breathe, that doesn't ask you to become smaller to be loved. She turned to him, curious, her heart steady but aware. And you found that peace. He reached into his pocket then, his hand trembling just slightly. I think I have. Because you're in it. When he opened his palm, there was a ring simple, unadorned, a small circle of gold that caught the last light of the sunset. He didn't kneel. There were no grand gestures, no speeches rehearsed, just honesty. Claire, he said, I don't want a love that burns. I want one that stays. I want a life that's honest, even when it's quiet. So, this isn't a proposal for forever, it's a promise for today. And every day after, if you'll have it. Her eyes filled, but not with surprise. She had felt this coming, not as an event, but as a truth growing slowly between them. She set her glass down, her fingers brushing his as she took the ring. For a moment, she simply looked at it, then at him. Yes, she said softly. Not because her heart was racing, but because it was calm. Because the love she felt was no longer something she had to question or earn, it simply was. He slipped the ring onto her finger, his hand warm against hers. The world around them seemed to hush, the sound of the water, the sigh of the wind through the trees, even the birds settling into their nests. It was as though life itself had paused to honor this quiet vow. They stayed like that for a long while, standing side by side as the first stars began to appear above the lake. No promises of perfection, no illusions of forever, just two people who had walked through fire, learned the language of loss, and still chosen to meet again in peace. Later that night, as they sat by the fire, Ethan looked at her and said, "You know, I used to think we were a story about mistakes." She smiled, resting her head against his shoulder. "Maybe we're a story about second chances. Or about grace," he added. She nodded. "Yes, about grace." The flames flickered gently, their light reflected in the lake beyond. The world outside was dark and vast, but in that small cabin there was warmth, not the wild, fleeting kind, but the steady glow of something real. And as Claire closed her eyes, she thought about how far they had both come from boardrooms and headlines to this quiet, humble beginning. The road had not been kind, but it had been honest. And maybe, she thought, that was the only kind of love worth having, the one that grows slowly, that forgives fully, that finds its home not in power or passion, but in peace. Somewhere outside, the wind moved through the trees, carrying the soft scent of pine and promise. And for the first time in years, the future no longer frightened her. Because love, she realized, was not about finding perfection. It was about finding peace and choosing it, again and again, for the rest of your days. That night, after the fire had burned low and the last light of day had folded into silence, Claire and Ethan sat by the window of their small cabin, watching the lake shimmer beneath a sky full of stars. It was the same lake where so much of their story had changed, where pain had once lived, and now peace quietly bloomed. Outside, the world was still, the kind of stillness that invites reflection, that makes you realize how much has been lost, and how much more has been found. They didn't speak much, they didn't need to. Sometimes love doesn't need the weight of words. It simply breathes between two people who have already said everything that mattered, in the soft glow of the fading embers. Claire thought about the path that had brought her here, every heartbreak, every mistake, every impossible choice. She realized that none of it had been wasted. Even the hardest days had been teachers, shaping her into someone who could love without losing herself. And maybe that was the greatest victory of all. Ethan reached over, his hand finding hers. It was a simple gesture, but it carried the quiet strength of everything they had learned together, that love was not about ownership, but understanding, not about passion that burns, but about presence that stays. As the night deepened, the moonlight touched the surface of Lake Tahoe, painting it silver. The gentle waves moved in rhythm, steady and patient like time itself, whispering, "You made it through." The narrator's voice enters here, soft and warm, like the echo of wisdom carried on a late summer breeze. Sometimes, the bravest act is not to fight for love, but to allow yourself to feel it again, to open your heart after it's been bruised, to choose hope over fear, because love, in its truest form, isn't about perfection or permanence. It's about presence, the courage to stand beside someone, not because you have to, but because you want to. And sometimes, the most extraordinary love stories aren't the ones that begin in passion or end in fireworks. They are the ones that teach us how to live with gentleness, how to see the humanity in another person and in ourselves. Claire had once believed success meant climbing ladders, earning praise, keeping everything under control. Ethan had once believed success was power the empire built, the name engraved in glass. But life, with its quiet insistence, had stripped away all illusions. Now they both knew true success isn't the empire you build. It's the heart you keep open when the world gives you every reason to close it. And perhaps that is what their story was truly about. Not scandal, not redemption, not even love in the romantic sense, but the human capacity to begin again, to forgive ourselves, to keep choosing kindness when cynicism would be easier. As the dawn approached, the horizon began to glow faintly pink, the first promise of morning stretching across the lake. Claire smiled, leaning her head on Ethan's shoulder. The air carried the smell of pine and water, clean, new, endless. In that moment, she understood something she never had before, that peace is not found in the absence of struggle, but in the quiet after you've accepted every part of your journey, even the messy, painful, unplanned parts, for her and for him. This was not a perfect ending. It was something better. It was true. The narrator's tone softens, inviting the listener closer not just to witness their story, but to feel the echo of their own. You see, every one of us carries a version of this, a moment when we lose what we thought defined us, only to discover what truly matters underneath. Maybe it's a job, a dream, a love that didn't go the way we hoped. But in the end, life has a way of circling back not to what was, but to what can be. And sometimes, when the dust settles and the heart grows quiet, we realize that the things we thought were endings were really beginnings in disguise. As the sun rose over Lake Tahoe, the light spread slowly across the water, brushing everything it touched with gold. Claire and Ethan sat together, watching the day unfold, no plans, no promises, just the simple grace of being exactly where they were meant to be. The world outside kept moving headlines, deadlines, the noise of ambition. But here, in this small corner of stillness, two people had found something more enduring than success. They had found truth, and truth, when you hold it gently enough, becomes love. So, dear listener, wherever you are, whatever season your heart is in, remember this. You are not your mistakes. You are not the things that fell apart. You are the person who chose to learn, to stay open, to keep walking. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is to let life soften you, not harden you. Because in the end, the real measure of a life isn't how high you climb or how loudly the world applauds your name. It's how deeply you've allowed yourself to love and how much light you leave behind in the hearts of others. As the camera fades from the lake to the sky, the last image lingers, the sun resting low over the still water, the waves moving with quiet purpose. The echo of two lives intertwined, not by perfection, but by choice. And with that, the voice closes gently, like a friend saying goodbye after a long, heartfelt conversation. Thank you for walking this journey with us. Wherever your story takes you next, may it be honest, may it be kind, and may you never forget, the greatest success is a heart that remains open. Then, as the screen fades to gold, the lake glimmers one last time, a mirror of life itself, imperfect, beautiful, and endlessly forgiving. In the end, Claire and Ethan's story isn't about wealth, power, or even romance. It's about the quiet strength it takes to live with honesty, Their journey reminds us that integrity is not built in public. It's shaped in the choices we make when no one is watching. Many of us spend years chasing success, the perfect job, the perfect image, the approval of others, only to realize that none of it means much if we lose ourselves along the way. True success, as Claire learned, isn't about how high you climb, but how open your heart remains when life brings you to your knees. Love, too, isn't about possession or perfection. It's about understanding, forgiveness, and the courage to start again after failure. Sometimes, the hardest act of love is letting go and trusting that what's meant for you will return in its own time. So, wherever you are in your story, remember, this life will test your character more than your talent. But if you keep your heart kind, your choices true, and your faith alive, you will find peace, not in what you gain, but in who you become. Thank you, my beautiful friends, for spending this time with me and for opening your hearts to another story of courage, love, and redemption. If Claire and Ethan's journey touched something deep within you, a memory, a hope, a quiet truth, I invite you to share that feeling forward. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another story that speaks to the soul. Your support helps keep these messages of hope and humanity alive. Until next time, stay kind, stay brave, and keep your heart open.